Emily Carter sat stiffly in a small, fluorescent-lit conference room after 15 years of relentless effort at PSL Med, the weight of the unavoidable downing upon her. Sarah Bennett, the scientific department director, sat back in her chair across the scuffed wooden table, a small smile pulling at the edges of her mouth. "We are reviewing your position," Sarah said, her voice clearly marked with pleasure, as though she had been waiting for this. Her arms were tightly drawn over her chest, her piercing hazel eyes tracking Emily like a predator weighing up its target. "The company is changing its strategy," Sarah said, flicking a sleek manila folder across the table with precise wrist action. "Your contributions have been excellent, but we are simplifying operations by combining the research department with applied development. You are aware of how it happens. Your position, well, it's probably going to be disbanded." Emily received the packet and her expression was inscrutable as her fingertips swept over it. She paid no attention opening it. She had seen enough severance packets in her time to know what awaited her inside, presumably the normal fare, 1 month's income, a pittance for her earned vacation days, and a false promise to keep her position open for 2 months if she cannot pull anything else together. The room's air seemed stuffy, heavy with unsaid tension. She looked at Sarah momentarily, saw the glimmer of success there, and wondered how long her manager had been planning this. "Streamlining," Emily said gently, her voice consistent even within her tempest. "Funny how always seems to mean cutting the people who've been here the longest." Though her smile became tighter, Sarah avoided the trap. "Emily, it's simply business. You have lived long enough to grasp that. When you get a moment, glance at the bundle. You will find it more than fair, in my opinion." Emily nodded once, her hands holding a heavy folder. Rising from her chair with a gentle dignity that betrayed the agony in her chest, she replied, "I'll look it over." The faint buzzing of the overhead lights hummed in her ears as she turned to go, a fitting soundtrack to the end of an era. Sarah paused momentarily, her fingers still dangling over the edge of the table as Emily closed the door. She had been taken aback, her well-written narrative falling apart against Emily's unflinching serenity. She had wanted, no, craved, hysteria, a tempest of rage, or at least a few gratifying tears. She could well imagine Emily's voice cracking, her hands shaking as she gripped the severance packet, perhaps even a desperate appeal to change her mind. That was the scene Sarah had replayed in her mind all week, a delicious little fantasy she'd clung to ever since she'd been handed the golden opportunity to deliver the news. Everyone in the department knew Emily was exceptional at her job. Brilliant, really. For 15 years, she'd moved through PSL Med with a quiet confidence, tackling complex research with an ease and enthusiasm that Sarah could never quite replicate. It gnawed at her, that effortless grace Emily carried, the way she commanded respect without demanding it. Sarah, with her polished suits and meticulously curated authority, secretly envied it, resented it, even. So when the directive came down to dissolve Emily's position, Sarah had practically leaped at the chance to be the one to break it to her. She'd wanted to savor the moment, to twist the knife just enough to make it sting, to finally see that unshakable facade crack. But Emily hadn't cracked. She'd taken it too coolly, her voice steady, her posture poised, as if Sarah had handed her a weather report instead of a career-ending blow. And that indifference, or worse, that quiet strength, was driving Sarah mad. Emily was 55, and the writing had been on the wall for years, an industry obsessed with flexibility, manageability, and kissing up to investors had little use for someone whose value lay in hard-earned experience. She'd seen the signs, the sidelong glances at meetings, the younger hires leapfrogging into roles she'd once trained them for, the subtle shift in priorities that favored flash over substance. She'd braced herself for the end, but she hadn't expected it to come with such brazen disregard, delivered by Sarah's gleeful hand, like a trophy kill. An hour after the meeting, Emily stood in the lab, her sanctuary of glass and steel, surrounded by the hum of equipment and the faint scent of antiseptic. She was sorting through a stack of notes when Sarah appeared in the doorway, leaning casually against the frame, arms crossed, a glint of smugness in her eyes. Emboldened by Emily's earlier composure, perhaps mistaking it for weakness, Sarah's voice cut through the quiet. "You need to vacate the lab by Friday," she said, her tone clipped and authoritative. "Your badge, equipment, and corporate tablet, all of it has to be returned before you go. The team will be informed this evening, so you might want to get ahead of that." Emily didn't look up right away. Her fingers lingered on a clipboard, tracing the edge of a graph that mapped ND27's latest trial results. Her team, 6 brilliant scientists she'd handpicked and nurtured over the years, had poured their souls into that molecule. Together, they'd built it from scratch, a revolutionary treatment for the early stages of neurodegenerative diseases, now teetering on the brink of FDA approval. ND27 wasn't just a project, it was a legacy, a lifeline for millions, and, oh, how convenient, a potential billion-dollar windfall for PSL Med. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were kicking out the architect just as the house was finished. She set the clipboard down with deliberate care and turned to face Sarah, her expression still infuriatingly calm. "Friday," she repeated, her voice low but steady. "And the team, my team, gets the news tonight? That's what? A few hours to process losing their leader before you swoop in with the corporate pep talk." Sarah's lips twitched, a flicker of irritation breaking through her poised exterior. "It's procedure, Emily. You know how this works. They'll adapt. They're young, resilient." "Resilient?" Emily cut in, a faint wry smile tugging at her mouth. "Funny, I thought that's what I'd been for 15 years. Guess it only counts when you're under 40. She stepped closer to the workbench, her fingers brushing the edge of a centrifuge they'd nicknamed Old Faithful after it survived a lab flood. "ND27's in its final trials, Sarah. You're really going to let me walk out that door with it this close to the finish line?" Sarah straightened, her confidence wavering for a split second before she masked it with a shrug. "The team can handle it. You trained them well, credit where it's due. But the company's moving forward, and you're not part of that vision anymore." Emily held her gaze, the air between them crackling with unspoken history. "Vision," she echoed softly, almost to herself. "Right." She turned back to the lab, her eyes sweeping over the space that had been her second home. The late nights, the breakthroughs, the quiet victories. "I'll be out by Friday," she said finally, her voice firm. "But you might want to pray that team's as good as you think they are, without me." With that, she picked up a stack of files and walked past Sarah, leaving the director standing alone in the doorway, the triumph she'd chased feeling oddly hollow. Emily strode down the corridor, her footsteps muffled by the sleek industrial carpet, the folder still tucked under her arm like a shield. As she passed the glass-walled meeting room, her gaze flicked sideways, catching the scene unfolding within. James Harrison, the CEO, stood at the head of the table, his broad shoulders squared as he jabbed a finger at a brightly colored projection slide. His voice, though muted through the glass, carried the same bombastic energy she'd come to expect, gesturing wildly, his face flushed with excitement as he touted numbers that promised a golden future. Projected revenues, no doubt, tied to ND27, the molecule she'd bled for, the one now poised to line PSL Med's pockets with billions. Her steps slowed for a fraction of a second, a bitter memory surfacing. Just over a year ago, at the annual medical congress in Chicago, James had taken the stage under blazing lights, his tailored suit gleaming as he unveiled ND27 to a rapt audience of industry giants. A key breakthrough for PSL Med, he called it, his voice booming with pride as he clicked through slides of data her team had painstakingly compiled. The room had erupted in applause, and Emily, seated in the crowd, had waited for the nod. the acknowledgement of the woman who'd led the charge. It never came. Not once had her name crossed his lips. Instead, he'd basked in the spotlight, shaking hands and accepting congratulations as if he'd conjured the molecule himself. Now, watching him through the glass, she felt a familiar twist in her gut. Not anger, not anymore, but a quiet, simmering resolve. She could almost hear his voice now, pitching the same narrative. ND27, our crown jewel, our ticket to the top. No mention of the late nights she'd spent calibrating dosages, the countless revisions to the trial protocols, the way she'd fought tooth and nail to keep the project alive when funding wavered. Just James, waving his arms like a conductor, claiming the symphony she'd composed. Back in her office, Emily closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing in the small, familiar space. She set the severance folder on her desk, its edges worn from her grip, and sank into her chair. For a moment, she simply stared at the cluttered shelves, books on neurodegeneration, framed awards, a faded photo of her team from ND27's first successful trial run. Then, with a steadying breath, she pulled her phone from her pocket and opened a message thread she'd hoped she'd never need to use. Her fingers hovered over the screen before typing a concise, resolute note. "Friday is my last day." The reply pinged back almost instantly, the screen lighting up with a burst of enthusiasm. Wow, but perfect timing. Dinner tonight to discuss details. Emily's lips curved into a smirk, a flicker of something defiant sparking in her chest. She glanced at the calendar pinned to the wall. Wednesday. 2 days from now, she'd walk out of PSL Med for the last time, leaving behind the lab, the team, and the betrayal disguised as progress. And come Monday, a new chapter would unfurl, one she'd been quietly preparing for, even if she hadn't wanted to admit it. She leaned back in her chair, the smirk softening into a faint, determined smile. "Let's see how they like this plot twist," she murmured to herself, already mentally drafting the next steps. Dinner tonight would be more than a meal. It would be the first move in a game PSL Med didn't even know she was playing. That evening, Emily stepped into the dimly lit ambience of the Orient restaurant, the air thick with the mingled scent of soy sauce and sizzling ginger. She spotted Michael Evans already seated at a corner table, his lanky frame slouched casually in a chair, a glass of red wine in hand. The CEO of Green Farmer, PSL Med's fiercest rival, looked up as she approached, his sharp blue eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and curiosity. He was still the same Michael she remembered from years past, wiry, quick-witted, with a mop of salt and pepper hair that made him look perpetually disheveled yet somehow commanding. "Emily Carter, as I live and breathe," he said, rising to greet her with a lopsided grin. "I'd say it's a surprise, but I've been half expecting you to jump ship ever since PSL started treating you like yesterday's news." He gestured to the seat across from him, and she slid into it, smoothing her coat as the waiter poured her a glass of water. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," Emily replied, her tone dry but laced with a hint of a smile. "I didn't jump, they pushed." Michael chuckled, swirling his wine. "Semantics. Either way, their loss is my gain." He leaned forward, his voice dropping into a mock conspiratorial whisper. "How does it feel to be dining with the enemy? I seem to recall you tearing into me at that Boston conference. What was it, 3 years ago? Defending PSL like it was your personal kingdom." Emily arched an eyebrow, sipping her water to buy a moment before responding. 4 years ago. And I wasn't defending PSL, I was defending my work. You were the one claiming our approach to protein folding was recklessly optimistic." "Guilty as charged," Michael said, raising his hands in surrender before breaking into a grin. "But I was right about one thing, you were too good for them. Always were. PSL's been coasting on your brilliance, while Harrison peacocks around like he invented the periodic table." She let out a soft, involuntary laugh, the tension of the day loosening just a fraction. "Careful, Michael. Flattery might get you somewhere tonight. Oh, I'm counting on it, he shot back, his sarcasm as sharp as ever. He reached into his briefcase and slid a slim folder across the table, her name typed neatly on the cover. Here's the offer. Lead scientist, full control of your own team, and a stake in whatever we build. ND27 might be PSL's baby, but I want you to birth something bigger with us. What do you say? Emily's fingers brushed the folder, her mind already racing through the possibilities. She met his gaze, steady and unflinching. I say we order first. Then you tell me how much rope you're giving me to hang you with when I outshine your wildest expectations. Michael laughed loud enough to turn a few heads at nearby tables. That's the Emily I remember. Deal. He flagged down the waiter, and as the evening unfolded, the Orient's warm glow seemed to mirror the spark of something new taking root, something PSL Med would come to regret letting slip away. As the waiter set down plates of steaming dumplings and fragrant stir-fry, Emily's thoughts drifted back to how she'd once seen Michael Evans. The media and the whispers that swirled around had painted him as a ruthless capitalist, a shark in a suit who'd bulldoze ethics and people alike if it meant a fatter bottom line for Green Farmer. She'd bought into it too, back when she was still PSL Med's loyal soldier, viewing him as the embodiment of everything her company claimed to stand against. That image had held firm until a delayed flight 3 years ago stranded them both in a crowded airport lounge, a chance encounter that peeled back the rumors to reveal the man beneath. Over the years, their exchanges had grown sporadic but steady. Once, over drinks at a hotel bar, she tossed out a half-serious jest. I'd probably never leave PSL Med, not the type to ditch the company that pays my bills and keeps my team fed. But if they ever fire me, you'll be my first call. He'd laughed, clinking his glass against hers. I'll hold you to that, Carter. Green Farmer's always got a seat for you. It had been a joke in every sense, lighthearted, absurd, a throwaway line neither of them thought would stick. Now, sitting across from him at the Orient, that punchline had landed with uncanny precision. She watched as he speared a dumpling with his chopsticks, his eyes glinting with the same mischief she glimpsed in that airport lounge. So, he said, popping the dumpling into his mouth and chewing thoughtfully, turns out you're a woman of your word. I should have bet money on PSL screwing you over eventually. Emily smirked, twirling her chopsticks between her fingers. And I should have known you'd have a contract ready before I even hung up the phone. What's this? Your secret Plan B stash for washed-up scientists? Hardly, he shot back, leaning forward with a grin. This is my Plan A, for poaching the best when PSL's too dumb to keep them. You're not washed up, Emily. You're a damn goldmine, and they just handed you to me on a platter. He tapped the folder between them. Sign that, and we'll make them regret it, starting Monday. For Emily, the sting of being fired wasn't the real wound. It was a symptom, not the disease. The true rot had set in years ago, carried on the polished shoulders of James Harrison when he swaggered into the CEO's office a decade back. At first, she chalked up the shifts at PSL Med to growing pains, a new leader, a new vision. But that illusion shattered with her first major breakthrough after his arrival, a novel treatment for chronic inflammation that had earned her quiet accolades from the scientific community. She'd expected support, maybe even pride, from the top. Instead, she got her first real glimpse of James, an egomaniac with a narcissist's fragile core, cloaked in charisma and a tailored suit. It baffled her at first, how someone so outwardly confident could unravel at the mere mention of her name in a trade journal or a conference Q&A, but the more she observed him, the clearer it became. James wasn't just basking in the company's successes, he was hoarding them, feeding an insecurity that flared every time Emily's work drew praise he couldn't claim. She'd pieced it together over late nights in the lab, watching him twist meetings into one-man shows, his voice booming over hers, his eyes narrowing whenever she spoke. He didn't just want credit. He needed it like oxygen, and her competence was a threat he couldn't tolerate. Then came the changes, subtle at first, a tweak to reporting structures, a shift in project priorities, until the company policies morphed into a mirror of his whims. He'd rewrite the rules to keep her in check, sidelining her input while plastering his name on every press release. And when she stumbled, because even she wasn't infallible, he pounced. A misplaced decimal in a budget report, a delayed response to an email. He'd haul it into the spotlight during staff meetings, his voice dripping with mock disappointment. "We can't afford slip-ups, Emily," he'd say, pacing the room like a prosecutor, while her team sat in uneasy silence, eyes fixed on their laptops. Publicly shaming her became his sport, a petty ritual to remind everyone who held the reins. The team saw it too, how horrible he was, how his temper could turn a room ice cold. They'd whisper about it over coffee in the break room, trading stories of his tirades, but fear kept their voices low. A few years back, the simmering tension between Emily and James had boiled over, turning personal in a way neither could ignore. It traced back to a single fateful moment, one that James, in his brittle pride, couldn't let go. It had been a high-stakes meeting, the kind where investors in crisp suits lined the boardroom, their eyes gleaming with dollar signs, as James unveiled his grand vision for PSL Med's future. He'd been mid-stride, gesturing at a glossy slide deck, when Emily, seated near the end of the table, did the unthinkable. She'd raised her hand, her voice cutting through his monologue with a calm, measured dissent. "I don't really agree with that approach, James. The data suggests we'd be overextending ourselves." The room had gone still, a collective intake of breath as heads swiveled between them. To Emily, it was just science, facts over flair, the kind of honesty she'd built her career on. But to James, it was a public gut punch, a crack in the invincible facade he'd spent years crafting. His smile had tightened, his eyes flashing with something dark, and though he'd waved it off with a forced laugh, always good to hear all perspectives, right, the damage was done. From that day, she wasn't just a threat to his ego, she was a target. He'd made it his mission to get back at her, a slow-burn vendetta cloaked in corporate maneuvers. It started small, rerouting her budget requests through endless red tape, assigning her team grunt work disguised as strategic realignment, but it escalated. He'd interrupt her presentations with pointed jabs, question her every move in front of the staff. And once, during a company-wide retreat, he'd jokingly toasted her as our resident contrarian, the barb landing like a slap while the room tittered nervously. James didn't want to fire Emily, not outright. Firing her would have been too clean, too final. What he craved was subjugation, the slow grind of bending her will until she fell in line like the others in his orbit. Emily was the anomaly, the one woman in his carefully curated circle who refused to cave, to flatter, to shrink under his shadow. She was his ultimate target, a puzzle he couldn't solve, and it drove him to the edge of obsession. Every time she met his barbs with that unshakable calm, every time she sidestepped his traps with quiet competence, he felt the sting of her defiance like a personal affront. She knew it, too, could see the frustration tightening his jaw, the way his control slipped a little more each time she didn't break. He devised what he thought was the ultimate move, threatened to fire her. Not do it, just dangle the axe, let it gleam in the light, and watch her scramble to please him. It was supposed to be the game changer, the moment she'd finally bow. He'd rehearsed it in his head, picturing her wide-eyed, stammering apologies, begging to keep her place. So a month before Sarah delivered the actual news, he'd summoned Emily to his corner office, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that screamed power, and laid his trap. "Emily," he'd begun, leaning back in his leather chair, hands steepled like some movie villain. "You're valuable, no one's denying that. But I'm starting to wonder if you're still the right fit. The board's pushing for fresh blood, and I can only defend you so much." He'd paused, letting the threat hang, expecting her to flinch. She didn't. Emily stood there, arms crossed, her gaze steady as she tilted her head slightly. "Defend me?" she'd said, her voice cool and even. "From what, James? The breakthroughs I've delivered. The billions ND-27's about to bring in." She stepped closer to his desk, her presence filling the room in a way his bluster never could. "If you want to threaten me, go ahead. Fire me. But don't pretend it's about the board or my performance. We both know what this is." James blinked, his practiced smirk faltering. He'd expected panic, not this. A mirror held up to his petty game. "I'm not threatening," he backpedaled, voice rising an octave. "I'm just saying we need alignment, and you're difficult." "Difficult?" she'd echoed, a faint, knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Funny. I thought that's what made me good at my job." She turned to leave, pausing at the door to glance back. "Let me know if you decide to pull the trigger, James. I'll be in the lab, working." And with that, she'd walked out, leaving him gripping the arms of his chair, his grand plan in tatters. It hadn't gone as planned, not even close. Instead of cowering, she'd called his bluff, and the memory of it gnawed at him. He'd stewed for weeks, plotting the real firing through Sarah, thinking it had finally stuck. Sitting across from Michael Evans, Emily's mind churned with a plan so audacious it felt like poetic justice. The clink of chopsticks against porcelain faded into the background as she leaned forward, her eyes glinting with a mix of resolve and mischief. She loved her work, the late nights unraveling molecular mysteries, the breakthroughs that lit up her team's faces. And her team, those 6 brilliant scientists she'd mentored into a powerhouse, meant more to her than any title or paycheck. What she was about to propose to Michael would flip the board entirely, leaving James Harrison choking on his own arrogance. The seed of this revenge had sprouted 3 weeks ago, born from a fluke discovery that still made her pulse quicken. While combing through ND-27's trial data, she'd stumbled on something odd. The patent hadn't been filed. She'd flagged it with the legal department, expecting a quick fix, but their response, a vague brush-off about an oversight they'd resolve soon, rang hollow. Suspicion gnawed at her, so she dug deeper, sifting through emails and memos until she unearthed the truth. An internal directive to register ND-27 as company IP without naming her as the inventor. The plan was clear: push her out, file the patent, and erase her from the story, banking on the fine print that all employee intellectual property belonged to PSL Med. But they'd underestimated her. What they didn't know, what no one at PSL Med knew, was that she'd been tinkering on her own time, using her personal equipment in her home lab. Late nights after the team went home, she'd refined ND-27, boosting its efficacy by 43% with enhancements that improved its permeability across the blood-brain barrier. A game-changing leap they'd never replicate without her notes. She documented every step, every tweak, and with a lawyer friend's help, filed a patent application in her own name, complete with a watertight evidence package. Michael slid the green farmer contract across the table, his grin sharp as a blade. "All the papers are ready. Sign, and Green Farmer gets an exclusive license for your patent. Monday morning, we drop a press release. Emily Carter, research director, with a shiny new blockbuster in tow. PSL Med won't know what hit them." Emily flipped through the documents, though she'd memorized every line. A 7-figure signing bonus, a hefty stock package, lifetime royalties on any product tied to her formula. She traced a finger along the terms, her mind already painting the fallout. James's face when he realized ND-27's golden goose had flown, tethered to her name and Green Farmer's banner. She looked up at Michael, her voice steady but electric with intent. "This isn't just about me. I want my team, all 6 of them. They built ND-27 with me. They deserve to see it through." Michael raised an eyebrow, then laughed, a low, appreciative sound. Twist my arm, why don't you? Fine, we'll poach the whole lot. Offer them deals they can't refuse. Harrison's going to lose his mind when his lab empties out overnight. Good, she said, picking up the pen and signing with a flourish. Let him. He wanted to play king. She was taking the crown. She slid the papers back, the weight of the day lifting into something triumphant. She'd secured her future, safeguarded her team, and locked down the rights to her life's work. Michael lifted his glass, the wine catching the soft orient light. To new beginnings, he said, his voice warm with victory. Emily met his gaze, her own glass rising to tap his with a delicate clink. To the recognition of one's own worth, she added, her tone carrying the weight of years reclaimed. The faint smile on her lips was both a promise and a reckoning. Thursday and Friday blurred into a storm of activity at PSL Med. Final meetings dragged on as Emily handed over projects she'd shepherded for years, her voice steady through the monotony of corporate farewells. She packed her office with methodical precision, files sorted, equipment labeled, personal items tucked into a single box. Rumors buzzed through the halls like static. Carter's out. Did you hear? They're letting her go. Secretaries cast her sympathetic glances over their coffee cups, their hushed, "I'm so sorry," murmurs trailing her like shadows. Junior researchers, wide-eyed and fumbling, sidled up during breaks, asking if she'd write them recommendations for the scientific community. "You've been amazing to work with," one stammered, clutching a notebook she'd once critiqued. She nodded, promised to help, and kept moving. The final exit interview unfolded in a sterile conference room on Friday afternoon, the air thick with the hum of corporate formality. PSL Med's lawyer, a wiry man with thinning hair and a pinched expression, sat across from Emily, his pen tapping rhythmically against a clipboard. He ran through the standard list of questions with the mechanical precision of a machine spitting out code, his eyes barely lifting from the paperwork. "Do you understand that all intellectual property created during your employment remains the property of PSL Med?" he asked, sliding the non-disclosure agreement across the table with a practiced flick of his wrist. Emily leaned back in her chair, a faint smile playing on her lips as she took the document. "Of course," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate. "Everything developed as part of my job duties, using the company's lab, and during work hours." She let the words hang, subtly stressing the qualifiers: job duties, company's lab, work hours. A verbal tightrope that sailed right over the lawyer's head. He was too busy scribbling check marks, his focus narrowed to the boxes he needed to tick to catch the precision of her phrasing. He glanced up briefly, adjusting his glasses. "And do you confirm that you have no copies of internal research or confidential information?" "I didn't take anything that belongs to PSL Med," Emily replied, her tone as honest as it was airtight. The patent, her patent, lived in her name, born from her own equipment, her own time, her own ingenuity. ND27's core might have roots in PSL's labs, but the 43% leap in efficacy, that was hers alone, locked away in a filing the company hadn't even sniffed. She met his gaze, her smile unwavering as he nodded absently and scratched another mark on his list. "Good, good," he muttered, flipping to the next page. "Sign here, and we're done." He slid the NDA back toward her, oblivious to the trap she'd sidestepped with surgical grace. Emily picked up the pen, her signature flowing across the line in a single confident stroke. She handed it back, rising from her seat as the lawyer gathered his papers, already mentally clocking out. "Pleasure doing business," she said lightly, though the irony was lost on him. Emily stood in her soon-to-be former office, methodically gathering the pieces of her 15-year tenure at PSL Med. Sarah appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with a studied nonchalance that didn't quite mask her curiosity. Her arms were crossed casually, but her eyes tracked Emily's every move. "So, what's your plan?" Sarah asked, tilting her head with feigned concern, a note of pity creeping in. "Will you take a short break?" "Nope," Emily said, folding the box's flaps with a crisp snap. I already have a new project starting on Monday. She caught the jolt of surprise in Sarah's eyes, a quick widening before it vanished behind a mask of polite interest. Oh, something interesting? Sarah pressed, her casual tone now edged with a faint strain. Emily's lips curved into a smile, small, knowing, and sharp enough to cut. Very interesting, a leadership position. Looking forward to it. Sarah blinked, then nodded quickly, her mind already pivoting elsewhere. Well, good luck, she muttered, her voice flat, as she retreated into her own thoughts, dismissing Emily as a loose end tied off. She turned and slipped away, heels clicking down the hall, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond her sight. Emily stepped out of PSL Med's gleaming glass fortress for the final time, her badge and work tablet surrendered in a crisp exchange at the security desk. She paused on the sidewalk, the weight of the cardboard box under her arm grounding her as she glanced back at the towering building minus 15 years of her life. Countless late nights, breakthroughs, battles etched into its sterile walls. Above, the conference room lights glowed against the dusk, a faint hum of activity spilling through the windows. She could picture it. James and his inner circle hunched over tables, already plotting how to carve up her research, parcel it out to younger, less seasoned chemists, pliable pawns eager to nod at his every word. A faint smirk tugged at her lips. They had no idea that in 3 days, that same room would host a frantic emergency meeting, their smug plans crumbling into chaos. Monday dawned bright and crisp, the sun cutting through a cloudless sky. Emily dressed with purpose, slipping into a new graphite suit she'd bought for the occasion, sharp, tailored, a quiet declaration of intent. At 7:30 a.m., a sleek black car from Green Farmer idled outside her building, its driver tipping his cap as she slid into the back seat. The ride to her new office was smooth, the city waking up around her, oblivious to the seismic shift about to hit the industry. She stepped into her new domain at Green Farmer, a spacious corner office with panoramic windows framing a sprawling view of the skyline. Michael was already there, leaning against her desk, a tablet in hand, and a grin splitting his face. The press release went out at 7:00 a.m., he said, handing her a coffee as she settled in. News outlets are eating it up. Communications is tracking the fallout. It's a feeding frenzy already. Emily took a sip, savoring the warmth as she glanced at the tablet. The announcement was a masterpiece of precision. Green Farmer had secured exclusive rights to ND27, the groundbreaking molecule, and proudly welcomed its creator, Dr. Emily Carter, as Director of Research. The text sang her praises, sole inventor, visionary scientist, detailing her journey and teasing her plans to weave ND27 into Green Farmer's pipeline. But the real dagger lay in the subtext. PSL Med couldn't touch the drug without a license from her new empire. Checkmate at 9:15 a.m., her phone buzzed with a message from her former team at PSL Med, the 6 scientists she'd forged into a unit of brilliance. It's chaotic here, the text read, tinged with awe and alarm. What have you done? Emily's smile widened, her fingers dancing over the screen as she typed back. Check your personal email. Offers await all 6 of you. Meanwhile, several miles away, PSL Med's headquarters buzzed with the frenetic energy that had hijacked the morning. James Harrison stormed into his office, his usual swagger undercut by the sight of his chief lawyer and CFO hovering at his door, their faces pale and taut with dread. The industry news had hit like a shockwave, Green Farmer's press release pinging their inboxes in unison, each word a grenade logged into their carefully curated world. By 9:30 a.m., the routine Monday management meeting had spiraled into a full-blown crisis session. The conference room was a war zone of scattered papers and raised voices. Emily's phone buzzed again. Another message from her former colleague lit up the screen. They are frantically pulling all files with your name on them. A second text followed fast. Someone just brought all the documentation on ND-27 to the conference room. They're dissecting it piece by piece. She could picture it vividly, James pacing the length of the room, his tie askew, barking orders as sweat beaded on his forehead. Sarah would be there, her composure fraying as she flipped through folders, while the legal team hunched over laptops, hunting for a shred of leverage in the fine print. The air would be thick with panic, the clatter of keyboards and rustling pages punctuated by James' booming demands. How did this happen? Who let her walk away with this? At 10:45 a.m., Emily's phone chimed with a new email. The sender's name flashed across the screen, James Harrison. She opened it, and even through the cold text, his desperation seeped out like damp rot. "Emily, it seems there's been a misunderstanding," it read, the words practically trembling. "Please call me at your earliest convenience to discuss the situation." She could hear his voice in her head, clipped, strained, the bravado stripped away. With a flick of her thumb, she forwarded it to Green Farmers' legal department, not bothering to dignify it with a response. Let him stew. The industry was electric with chatter, rumors crackling through networks like wildfire. PSL Medstock had plummeted 7% in hours, a free fall fueled by the morning's upheaval, while Green Farmers soared 12%, buoyed by the promise of ND-27 and its mastermind. 3 major pharmaceutical publications, Pharma Today, BioBreakthrough, and MedInnovate, had already emailed, clamoring for interviews about the seismic shift that had blindsided the market. Emily's name was everywhere, a phoenix rising from PSL's ashes. Michael poked his head into her office as she unpacked a framed photo of her team onto her new desk, the panoramic windows bathing the room in golden light. "How are you feeling?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe with a grin that said he already knew the answer. Emily paused, setting the frame down with care, and met his gaze. "Vindicated," she said, the word carrying the weight of truth. "For 15 years, others took credit for my achievements. I was told I should be grateful just to have a seat at the table. Smile, nod, don't rock the boat. And now, finally, recognition." Her voice was steady, but the fire in it was unmistakable. Before Michael could reply, her new assistant, a brisk young woman named Lena, appeared at the door, clipboard in hand. "Dr. Carter, the research team is ready for you in the main conference room," she said, her tone crisp and professional. "Also, the CEO of PSL Med has called several times in the last hour." Emily's lips twitched into a faint, satisfied smile. "Inform him that I have meetings all day," she replied calmly, adjusting the cuffs of her graphite suit. "Our lawyers will contact him later this week to discuss licensing terms." Lena nodded, jotted a note, and vanished as quickly as she'd come. Emily strode toward the main conference room at Green Farmer, her new role settling over her like a perfectly fitted coat. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced at the screen, a message from one of her former PSL Med team members. "The board of directors has called an emergency meeting. James is about to explode. P.S. Our team is accepting your offer. When do we start?" A grin flickered across her face as she typed back. "Welcome aboard, Monday, 8 a.m. sharp." She slipped the phone away, the hum of triumph fueling her steps. Her crew, her 6 brilliant scientists, was coming with her, and James' empire was cracking at the seams. Emily settled into her new role at Green Farmer with an ease that surprised even her. The transition was as seamless as slipping into a well-worn glove. The respect here was palpable, a stark, refreshing contrast to the sidelong glances and veiled digs she'd endured at PSL Med. People listened when she spoke, their nods genuine, their questions sharp and engaged. No one swooped in to claim her research as their own. No one muttered about new generations of scientists, as if her experience were a dusty relic. At Green Farmer, her age and expertise were currency, not liabilities, and it fueled her every move. By Wednesday, the crisis's shockwaves were reverberating across the industry. Two major medical holdings reached out to Green Farmer, hinting at cutting ties with PSL Med. ND27's absence was a gaping wound they couldn't ignore. Green Farmer's stock climbed another 8%, a rocket fueled by Emily's coup, while PSL Med's continued its nosedive, shedding value with every passing hour. Then her phone rang. The caller ID flashed a familiar name, Grace from HR, the same woman who'd handed Emily her severance packet with a tight-lipped smile just days ago. Emily answered, her tone cool and composed. "Grace, what can I do for you?" "Emily," Grace began, her voice cautious, clinging to a thin thread of professionalism. "I'm calling to discuss the patent situation. We believe there might have been a misunderstanding regarding ownership rights." Emily's lips curved slightly, though her eyes stayed sharp. "I don't think there's any misunderstanding. My employment contract is clear. Anything I developed on my own time with my own resources belongs to me. The patent documentation backs that up, every page of it." A beat of silence. Then Grace pressed on, tentative but persistent. "James hoped you might discuss possible options. All negotiations go through Green Farmer's legal department now," Emily said firmly, her words a steel wall. "I'm sure they'll be happy to arrange a meeting to discuss licensing terms." The line went quiet. Grace's breath caught on the other end. Finally, she exhaled, a soft, resigned sound. "I'll pass this along," she said, her courtesy clipped as she hung up. That afternoon, Emily stood at the head of Green Farmer's boardroom, delivering her first official presentation as research director. The polished wood table gleamed under the lights, and the board of directors, sharp-eyed men and women in crisp suits, watched her intently. She outlined the company's research strategy, ND27 at its core, her voice steady and commanding as slides clicked by. No longer relegated to the shadows as she'd been at PSL Ned, she owned the podium, her presence filling the room. She caught approving nods, a few murmurs of agreement, and even a smile from the chairman. This was her stage now, and she played it masterfully. Daniel joined Emily for a video call that afternoon, his screen flickering from his half-packed office at PSL Med. "They're scrambling to cobble together a new research team," he said, adjusting his glasses with a wry grin. "Trying to bypass your formula and its patent. James is out there claiming they can whip up an alternative drug in 18 months. Emily laughed, a short, sharp sound that echoed her disbelief. 18 months. The original took me 3 years, with a full grasp of the pharmacokinetics and biochemistry. He's delusional." "Exactly," Daniel said, nodding. "No one's buying it, especially after our team dropped our resignations like a synchronized bomb. The knowledge drain's catastrophic. They've got nothing left to stand on." Later that day, PSL Med's legal team finally reached out to Green Farmer, their tone clipped and reluctant, requesting a discussion on licensing terms. Green Farmer's lawyers, armed with a strategy Emily and Michael had honed, fired back with a proposal as calculated as it was brutal: a licensing fee triple the industry standard, plus a public statement acknowledging Emily as ND27's sole creator. Michael chuckled when they reviewed it in his office, leaning back in his chair. PSL Med would rather torch the deal than admit they fired the brains behind their golden goose. "Then they'll have to build from scratch," Emily said with a shrug, her voice cool and unyielding. "And every day they waste chasing my shadow, our lead grows wider." Come Monday morning, 10 days after she'd walked out of PSL Med, Emily sat at the head of Green Farmer's main conference room, her newly assembled research team arrayed around the table. Daniel and the 5 other scientists from PSL Med filled the seats, their faces alight with enthusiasm as they dove into plans for ND27's next generation. The air crackled with ideas, the whiteboard filling with diagrams and timelines, a palpable sense of purpose binding them together. This was her vision, her people, her future unfolding in real time. As the meeting wrapped, Lena, her assistant, slipped into the room, her expression urgent. "Something important happened," she said, clutching her tablet. "PSL Med just announced an emergency leadership change. James Harrison is stepping down, effective immediately." The news hit like a thunderclap, rippling through the room before spilling into the wider world. Within hours, major business outlets, Forbes, Bloomberg, The Wall Street Journal, blared the update. The PSL Med board had lost faith in James after his failure to secure ND27, a blunder that tanked their stock and their credibility. Sarah Bennett, the head of the legal department, and the architects of the patent fiasco were out too, swept away in the purge. Later that evening, Emily's inbox pinged with an unexpected email from Thomas Brooks, the newly minted interim CEO of PSL Med. Unlike James' frantic, flailing plea, this message was a study in brevity and respect. "Dr. Carter, congratulations on your new position. I've been brought in to steer PSL Med through this storm. I'd like to discuss fair licensing terms for your formula. We're prepared to officially acknowledge your contribution and address the fallout from prior leadership. Are you available to meet next week?" Emily forwarded it to Michael with a succinct note. "Phase 1 complete." His reply shot back instantly. "Excellent work. The board sees this as your first big win for Green Farmer. Looks like PSL Med's finally grasping the price of underestimating innovation and its creators." 3 months later, Emily stood on the stage at the National Medical Congress, poised to deliver the keynote address. The auditorium buzzed with a who's who of the pharmaceutical world, industry titans, investors, journalists, and wide-eyed young scientists, all there to hear her. The host's voice boomed through the speakers. "And now, I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Emily Carter, Director of Research at Green Farmer and creator of the revolutionary molecule ND27, set to redefine the neuromodulator market." Applause swelled as she stepped forward, the spotlight warm on her face. She paused at the podium, her gaze sweeping the crowd. A year ago, she'd been in this very hall, tucked in the back rows with the PSL Med delegation, listening as James crowed about breakthroughs she'd built, her name conspicuously absent. Now, the room was hers. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear and resonant. "Today, I want to talk about medical innovation, the protection of intellectual property, and why we must truly value the contributions of scientists, no matter their rank." Her presentation wove through ND27's journey, but she didn't linger on technicalities. Instead, she turned the lens outward, addressing a deeper rot in the industry. Without naming PSL Med, she drove her point home. Companies must champion their innovators, not discard them like interchangeable parts. The audience leaned in, some nodding, others scribbling notes. When she finished, a cluster of young researchers swarmed her at the podium. A lanky 30-year-old with earnest eyes confessed, "Your story shifted how I work. I've started logging everything, even my off-hours ideas." Emily smiled. "Smart. Your ideas deserve protection." That evening, as the Congress wound down, her phone lit up with a news alert. PSL Med had caved, signing a deal with Green Farmer that publicly crowned her ND27's creator. Their stock had stabilized, but their valuation lingered far below its pre-crisis peak, a shadow of its former self. A year to the day after Sarah had ordered her to vacate her PSL Med lab, Emily sat in her expansive Green Farmer office, poring over the latest quarterly research report. Under her helm, the company had launched 3 groundbreaking drugs, spun from ND27's enhanced formula, seizing a hefty chunk of the market from PSL Med and beyond. A light knock interrupted her. Michael, wielding a bottle of champagne and 2 flutes. "Happy anniversary," he said, setting the glasses down with a grin. "The board sent me to break the news in person. Green Farmer just overtook PSL Med in market cap. First time ever. Emily's smile was soft, steady, not triumph, but a quiet, earned satisfaction. This is what happens when you truly value innovation. Michael poured as Lena slipped in with an elegant envelope, an invitation to speak at the annual summit, themed how proper documentation changed the industry. He skinned it, chuckling. "You're a symbol now, Carter." A cautionary tale about a boss who didn't see what he had till it walked out the door. It's echoing across the sector. Over at PSL Med, Thomas Brooks had stayed on as CEO, ushering in reforms that echoed Emily's Green Farmer playbook: revamped IP protections, real recognition for inventors. She'd heard he'd framed her story as a wake-up call, a lesson in what not to lose. It was never about revenge, Emily said, lifting her glass. It was about recognition, showing this industry that innovations don't just appear, people make them, and those people deserve respect, too. Michael toasted, their glasses clinking. Sunlight slanted through the window, catching the bubbles in her champagne. At 56, Emily had found what she'd chased her whole career, not just success, but a legacy indelibly hers. ND27 bore her name now, a cornerstone of an industry she'd reshaped, right where it belonged. 6 months after her commanding keynote at the National Medical Congress, Emily arrived in Chicago for the Biopharma Summit, a glitzy affair packed with the industry's elite. Green Farmer's star had soared under her watch, ND27's offshoots rewriting market rules and raking in profits. She was there as a panelist, tapped to dissect innovation under pressure, with a lineup of CEOs and researchers, a fitting gig for someone who'd turned pressure into a battering ram. Clad in a sleek graphite blazer, portfolio in hand, she navigated the hotel's bustling marble lobby, aiming for a quick coffee before the session. Then she saw him, James Harrison, cutting through the crowd like a dull blade, his once sharp swagger dulled by time and failure. His suit was wrinkled, his hair thinning, but that familiar arrogance still clung to him like a bad cologne. He barked at an assistant trailing him with a tablet, oblivious to her, until their paths collided near the coffee stand. His head snapped up, eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers, his lips twisted into a sneer. "Well, well, Emily Carter," he drawled, his voice dripping with mockery, slumming it with the coffee crowd before you dazzle the peasants. Emily's expression stayed ice-cold, her grip tightening on her portfolio. "James, still dragging assistants around to prop up your ego, I see," he snorted, shoving his hands into his pockets with a lazy swagger that didn't quite land. "Heard you're on some big panel today. Guess Green Farmer's milking your little stunt for all it's worth. Must feel good, playing the martyr who struck gold." Her lips twitched, a razor-thin smile. "It feels good building something that lasts. You wouldn't know. You were too busy tearing down anything you couldn't control." James' eyes flashed, his smirk hardening. "Oh, spare me the sanctimonious crap, Emily. You think you're some hero. You stabbed PSL in the back, took your toys, and ran. Real classy." He stepped closer, voice lowering to a venomous hiss. "I made that company what it was. You were just a cog I should have replaced sooner." She didn't flinch, meeting his glare head-on. "You made a throne out of quicksand, James. I handed you ND27, 15 years of my work, and you tried to erase me. Your mistake was thinking I'd let you." Her tone was steel, cutting through his bluster. "You didn't replace me, you lost me, and look where it got you." He laughed, a harsh, brittle sound, waving a hand dismissively. "Lost you? Please. I cut dead weight. PSL's fine. New team, new drug. 18 months, tops." He smirked. "You're a blip, Carter. A has-been who got lucky." The lie hung heavy, his bravado cracked as the assistant shifted nervously behind him. Emily tilted her head, gaze dissecting him. 18 months? You couldn't replicate my coffee order in that time, let alone ND27. Your stock's in the gutter, your team's gone, and you're out. Keep telling yourself it's fine, maybe someone will buy it. She glanced at her watch, then back at him. I've got a panel to crush. Enjoy your, whatever this is. James' face flushed red, his fists clenching as she stepped past him. You think you've won, he called after her, his voice rising, drawing stares. You're nothing without PSL. I'll bury Green Farmer. Watch me. She didn't break stride, her heels clicking a steady rhythm as she left him fuming in her wake. Bury yourself first, she muttered under her breath, the words lost to the lobby's din. James stood there, a fading king, shouting at shadows, his assistant shrinking behind him. Emily didn't need to look back. She felt the victory in every step. He could snarl and posture all he wanted. She'd taken his empire apart, brick by brick, and he'd never touch her again. The panel awaited, and as the room erupted in applause for her entrance, she knew who'd really won.